We are really honored today to introduce our keynote speaker. Ken, you want to stand up and we'll bring you up here. So Ken Bouyer, when I went to Natasha and talked to some other folks at Ernst Young about potentially having this event here, I don't remember if it was Natasha or somebody else on your team, but they said, probably Natasha. Okay, so if you don't have his autograph yet, it kind of came across that way. It was sort of like, oh, wow, if we can get Ken to do this, he would be so perfect. Would that be good? I'm like, yeah, that would be good. So Ken's going to talk to us specifically about Ernst Young and the work that they've done. And then the microphone is yours, sir, and along with the clicker.
Thank you. Round of applause, Stephen. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it, Faith, as well. The first thing I would say, I appreciate the intro, is to lower your expectations about my comments. Please do that immediately. But again, welcome to our office here. A little bit about me, and I've got a few comments around the firm and our D&I journey, and I will focus a little bit on bias and have the panelists come up to talk about and dig a little bit deeper. I actually just celebrated my 29th year with the firm, believe it or not. People are like, you must be crazy. 29 years in a variety of roles, and I grew up right across the pond. By that I mean the Hudson River. I grew up in New York City and started with the firm in the audit practice, did some work in our consulting practice for a number of years before taking on this role where I essentially lead all of our D&I efforts, recruiting efforts for the firm, and work very closely with Natasha and a number of other folks. I've got folks on my team here as well. But really, I think about every single day, how do I drive the strategy for the Americas to make EY a pretty diverse place? I think, Stephen, your definition around the broadness of diversity, clearly what we're focused on. Inclusion, would agree. The piece I would add to that, though, and something as a firm that we talk about, is we also need to have an inclusive leader, right? So you could have diversity in your organization. That's terrific. You can figure out how you're going to use them. But the reality is your manager, your leader of that team, needs to be an inclusive leader. Because you could have diversity, don't have the right environment, and don't have the right leader, and frankly, you lose all the potential power of diversity. So I would say, as you think about where you are in your respective journeys, if you have diversity, if you're still trying to get it, is your environment inclusive? But are the leaders and the managers and the folks that they're going to work with every single day, are they really an inclusive leader? So when I go back, and this is way before I was involved in it, but in the early 90s, that's when EY began our journey around diversity. Back then, the words were very different. We had what was called the Office of Minority Recruiting. Full stop. That was it, right? And so when I think about those days, again, I think I was in audit or something back then, but the only thing we would focus on is how do we go out and recruit more Black and Latino professionals into the firm. That was it. Obviously, it's evolved. The definition has clearly evolved over the years, and certainly the firm's focus, which has been a great thing. Just to give you a quick stat on some numbers, I'll look this up. When we go to campus and hire folks back then, about 10% of our hires, minority hires. 10% were minority hires. This past year, as a firm will hire over 6,000 people in full-time, about almost 9,500 full-time and intern combined. We do this annually, by the way. So about 9,400 in rough numbers. 40% of our full-time hires are minorities. 40%, about half are women, right? So we've made some good progress, but I would tell you, for those of you who are just starting this journey, I know there's a number of firms who've been on this journey for a while. An early mistake that we made, though, when it was just this Office of Minority Recruiting, was we went and we hired wonderfully talented minorities, but we didn't look at the firm's environment. And so the assumption was, let's go out and hire all this different talent, bring them to the firm, and everything will take care of itself. I would tell you that's not the case. And so if you're just starting this journey and you're going out to hire folks who are diverse, that's wonderful. But I would ask you to think about, what's your environment like today? Are you ready to receive people that have different perspectives, points of view? And are you ready for that within your organization? I would tell you most are not. Most companies are not. And if I'm always brutally honest, because I actually consult with a number of our clients on this topic as well. They want to learn from us, we want to learn from them, And when I go in and ask questions about their strategy or their focus, I'll walk away from some of these client meetings and say they're not really committed to this thing called diversity. Let's just be honest. Some organizations, frankly, just want to check the box. And I'm not saying we at EY are perfect in this, because we're not. We're learning every single day. But the one thing I can be really clear about is we're incredibly committed to this. Incredibly committed. So if you're a practitioner, if you're in the space working, you should think about, is your organization really committed here? And if you are sitting in a seat and call yourself a practitioner and really care about this issue, I'd ask, what are you doing in the space to make a difference? I'm a firm believer in, when you have a seat at the table, whatever seat that may be, don't just sit there, do something. And if you talk to any of my team, my folks here, in this space, in this role, I'm constantly doing something. I actually call myself a healthy agitator. I'm a healthy agitator when it comes to D&I. I think all of you need to figure out, what role are you going to play? How will you facilitate change within your respective organizations, firms, and companies? Because this work, as Natasha mentioned, is incredibly hard. I have diversity fatigue, even I get it. But I am committed to the cause, because here's why. So I mentioned I'm with the firm 29 years. I started in the audit practice in New York. I show up my first day of training, probably actually a start class about this size, 120, 130 people. I walk into the room, and this is just one element of diversity. There's only a handful of people of color in that audit start class of 130 back then. So of course I do the thing, I walk in the room, I look around, I did an intern with the firm, I look around, I'm like, man, there's not a lot of people that look like me here. And by that I mean tall and good looking. What were you thinking? See, well, let's talk about you for a second. But there weren't a lot of people that looked like me in the room, but that made me feel a certain kind of way. And then frankly, if I had a lot more time, I could tell you a lot more of my story. My first couple of years at the firm were really rough as a result. Because there's things like imposter syndrome and all that stuff that we go through if you're just different anywhere you are. Makes you react different, make you come to the workplace in a different way. And in a nutshell, I would tell you I lost my identity in my first couple of years at the firm. Man, I wish I had more time, but I won't take, I know. But I lost my identity, but the good news, I found it, and I had great mentors, coaches to say, hey, Ken, we hired you to be who you are. Don't try to be like the white partner you striving to be like. I'm just going to keep it 100 so the young people know what that means. I'm going to keep it real and authentic for the more mature people. I don't know why I point to you guys, but I'm just going to say, I just want to keep it 100. But it's been an incredible journey, but I'm passionate about it because I know how I felt my first couple of years at the firm and the impact that had on things like my performance, my confidence, and really reflecting on, did I make the right decision to work at the firm? The good news for me, the answer is absolutely yes. I've been blessed with an incredible career, but those first couple of years are rough. My goal is, how do I ensure that our folks we're hiring, all of our people, don't have to be like me when I first started? So that's why I'm so passionate about the work that I do. With our young people on campus, I spend a lot of time on campus. Quick comment about campuses. The campus environments now are really, really stressful. And specifically around hate crimes, way up. That's just true, not just campus, by the way. In the last couple of weeks, you Google, you look up the stuff that's happening on these campuses. Personally, that's concerning, because all of us are recruiting these kids. We want them to have jobs as well, but we also want them to come to our environment, when we call it having a global mindset, right? The ability to work across cultures, have cultural dexterity, however you want to position it. But on these college campuses where theoretically they should be learning and growing, there are some real issues on campuses. So if you have an ability to affect change on a campus, one of the things I love to do, I go to a lot of our major campuses, we recruit a lot of people, and I have meetings. I call them Inclusiveness recruiting meetings, visits. And I'll talk to the dean or the university president or the provost and said, help me understand your strategy as it relates to diversifying your business school. Because I look at their numbers, I'm an audit guy, so I look at their numbers in advance, and usually the numbers aren't great in certain pockets. And I'll say, I looked at your numbers, help me understand, what are you doing to change that? Diversity is important to EY. You're a great source of talent for us, but frankly, we need more diversity in your business school or the School of Engineering. Those discussions are incredible. But also I walk away with that saying, some of these universities aren't really committed to this. What they do is they know a guy like me is coming, and I'll sit down with the dean, and the dean gives me a wonderful brochure of a few people of color and some women and some like stuff. They're like, see, we're great. I'm like, really? I have a few questions for you. And so what happens is I'll walk away and I'll debrief with the team, and they'll say, Ken, what do you think? I'm like, man, they're really committed. They're investing, they got people, the dean's behind it, the president's behind it, or I'll say they just gave me the glossy brochure tour. I've been glossy brochured. That happens. That's my term. I've been glossy brochured. So that's the backdrop as to the journey. So as a firm, again, we're learning every single day. This is hard work, like hard work, and you've got to be committed to it. So let me stop there. I want to cover a couple tactical things. And we talked about, what do you see, by the way, when you look at that picture? Call it out. What do you see? Some duck and bunny. How can that be possible? Who saw a duck? Who saw a bunny? Wow. How is that possible? It's all about your frame of reference, your perspective. There's actually a duck and a bunny in there. Some of you are still like, I only see one, but there's actually two. The bill's on the upper left, and then the bunny's more facing to the right. I did this in an audience, and someone said, I see a pigeon. I said, you should go work at one of our competitors. No, I'm only kidding. I know there's a number of you here. You guys all do great work. Thank you. So anyway, it's really about your frame of reference. Bias, and I won't spend a lot of time. I know you guys are very familiar with this term. But that's one definition of what this thing called bias is like. So I'll push through that, and we'll talk about that later with the panel because they've got some great thoughts on it. Really, biases are just shortcuts, right? It's the way you make decisions really quickly. And I'm going to cover a little bit about how bias impacts us in recruiting from my perspective. Frame of reference. So when I put up the duck and picture and all that, you yelled out different things, but the reality is there are factors that influence the way you see the world and the way the world sees you. Trust me. And generally speaking, what happens on the biological front are things that you're born with. You know, how old, sexual orientation, skin color, personality. And when people walk into a room, or when I walk up here, the first thing you see is like my features. Oh, he looks African American, he's tall, looks like he's 90, like those kind of things. Those are the first things that you notice about an individual. It happens to all of you. We kind of size you up. And then in the middle, social and cultural are kind of things you learn along the way based on your environment. So where you grew up, if you grew up in the Midwest, if you grew up in California, right, that shapes the way you see the world, your frame of reference. And then finally, at an individual level, that's just your own personal journey in life. So let me give you a couple of examples. People see you first based on the biological features. So I walk in the room, I stand up here, you make some quick assessments about me, just based on my appearance only. You don't know me, but you just bias. You go right to this guy's, whatever he is, or gal's, whatever she is. And then you start to make assumptions about me. Don't even know it. You're all nice people, but the reality is you're making assumptions. This is where the bias starts to kick in. Should I be fearful of this guy? Who is he? And I can tell you, unfortunately, so many stories of how, in particular, my skin color and race has impacted the way people receive me. It happens. It's just something I've dealt with my entire life. Whether it's being followed in the stores, walking on an elevator and the woman clutches her purse tighter. And I'm like, I can write a check for everything you got and then some. But whatever, that doesn't matter. Told you I'm going to keep it 100. So, that's bad. Keep me honest on time. Let me know. Thank you. So, but that affects the way I see the world and the way the world sees me based on skin color as an example. If you go in the middle on the social and cultural, right, so things you learn from your environment, that's the way I see the world. The example I would give you is a generational frame of reference for me. And this is going back a few years, but I'd go around to a lot of our offices and I'd see our staff folks working. And they'd have these things called earbuds in their ear, or headphones on. my initial reaction, this is a generational frame of reference, is why are they wearing those things? Those are horrible. That was my generational frame of reference. But here's why my reaction was like that back then. It's changed. Because when I was a young staff person sitting in the audit room, I couldn't wait for the partner to come in or the manager to come in so I can eavesdrop on their conversation. I don't recommend you eavesdrop, but the point is I would learn a lot about what was happening on that client through listening to their conversations. Now, if I had my Sony Walkman headphones on, and some of you know what those are, those who don't Google Sony Walkman headphones. If I had my Sony Walkman in my ears and had music playing, there's no way I could hear what was happening. And in fact, take it further, perhaps the partner would think, that person's not really interested in being here. Why are they tuning us out? So my reaction was, you're tuning me out or tuning the world out, and all you care about is the music or what you're listening to. So I talked to people, our young people. I said, well, why do you wear those? Because this is the other important part of frame of reference is you got to ask questions, because your bias will allow you to jump to conclusions, but you have to ask questions. So I ask questions. Why do you wear that? Well, Ken, we grew up this way. We always had headphones. I studied with them. I can multitask. I don't agree with that, by the way. So I felt better. Still don't agree, but I'm like, okay, I understand. You grew up like that. I did not. So let me get out of the way. Right? So that's a frame of reference, a bias, a conclusion I made. Finally, on the individual level, this is about your experience. So I've got a 15-year-old daughter, but my wife and I, we were married for a long time before we had Kelsey. And so we travel, we'll be on airplanes, and then you see this, and don't judge me for this. You see this young couple walking down the aisle with a small baby. You're like, please don't sit next to me. No. I love babies, I love kids. So anyway, so I'm like, all right, we got to get noise-canceling headphones. How ironic is that? So now we have stuff on. But it wasn't until we had Kelsey, until we were that young couple, well, we were a little bit older, but to that couple walking down. And I'm like, there are people right now saying, please don't sit next to me. Please don't sit next to me. But that, frankly, helped change my frame of reference. So now if I'm on an airplane, I see a young couple, or a couple with a kid, I'm like, you can sit next to me. But I got headphones and noise canceling, and I download all my music, so I can't really hear. Factors that influence your frame of reference, right? Each of you, based on the frame of reference that you have and you bring, now all of a sudden the bias kicks in. Assumptions are made. And in the world of D&I, this is when we get in trouble. When you just look at someone's physical appearance and all of a sudden make assumptions, for some people it could be deadly. It could be deadly. And so for all of us who are in this space, the folks at your organizations, the question is, and it's important to pause before you jump to conclusions and make assumptions about someone or people in general. And I think so much of this work is about educating and raising awareness. And so this is just one, I have a ton of examples, but this is just one example of frame of reference and the impact on diversity and how bias creeps in. And this happens, you could give examples around performance reviews, who gets certain assignments in your organization. If students are in the classroom, if you're the only woman in an engineering class, can you imagine how that feels? If you're the only person of color in a chemical engineering major at school, and that's my nephew, so we're having a lot of hard conversations. First time he's ever experienced racism, I won't tell you the school. He's like, I'm the only person in here, and when we have to serve and sit on project teams, I'm always the last chosen, if I get chosen at all. So that's why I'm passionate about this stuff. I know we are better when we have diversity. And I think each of you have to think about what does this mean to you personally and to your organization? And what will you do to affect change? Frankly, we need everybody in the boat to make change. Last piece I'll mention, because I think I've got to get our panel up here, right? The last piece I'll mention is in our early days of our journey, here's the biggest mistake that we made, in my opinion. We excluded the white guys. In fact, at that time, diversity was about everything except for the white guys. And we realized we need the white guys in the boat too. Oh, by the way, white guys are diverse in their right as well. I got a number of friends who are white. and they're not all the same, white guys in particular. So I think depending on where you are in your journey, I would say this is where the inclusion piece really matters. Like it's about everybody. Gotta get Steven in the boat. You're diverse in your own way.
I would sink it.
He would sink the boat, he says. But we'll learn a different way to paddle. Learn a different way to keep you afloat and keep all of us afloat, right? So that's about being inclusive, right? So I think ultimately that's what you have to get down to. So I'm going to stop. I don't know if I have time for questions or anything, and I had another example, but I think you guys got the point. But I will, super quick, because I think, so staying along with the frame of reference, right? And this is specific to recruiting. The ladder of inference, we call this. You start from the bottom. And this is, imagine you being in an interview with someone, with Jane. So you're sitting across from Jane, and Jane asks literally one question. And so you take that observable data, the one question she asks, or that one data point, because that's the data you select or you hear, and you automatically start to add meaning and make assumptions. You're like, she should speak up more. I'm interviewing her. Why does she only have one question? Then you start to make assumptions and draw conclusions. She's not going to be assertive enough to speak up in the firm. She won't be able to lead a team. You know what? We shouldn't even extend Jane an offer. Done. Jane's done. Right there. Now, here's how I think you should think about frame of reference and shifting that. You could shift it this way. Different interviewer. Jane's across the table. Jane asks a question. I select data. Look at meanings. Man, that was a very insightful observation and question that Jane asked me. She was really listening to me. She really did her research. It was an incredible question. Man, she has a good understanding of the firm, and she really is a great listener. I'm drawing conclusion. I'm like, she's going to make a great addition to the team. One of our best candidates, Jane's going to get an offer. This happens all the time. If you're interviewing, important that you work with your folks who are part of the process to make sure they understand what bias means, unconscious bias, and they don't let that creep into the recruitment process. And I didn't even talk about AI and all the stuff we're doing now and how there's a lot of bias built in there potentially. But for each of you, because we do a lot of training for our recruiters around bias, even for our people in the firm. I was in Orlando last week at an event. We always celebrate promotions. So our new managers, we had like 4,000 new managers in Orlando from the Americas, celebrating their promotion. We call it a milestone event. So I always speak down there, and we always bring in a professor to come and talk about bias to all 4,000 managers. Dr. Bernazzi from Harvard, she's fantastic. There's a woman here in Columbia we use as well, Dr. Kathy Phillips. But the point is, how do you help people see the world differently, to challenge their frame of reference? And this is where I think we get in trouble. So that's what we need to do, in my opinion, more of. But anyway, let me pause there. And first I'll see if there's any questions, and then we'll bring up the panel. Okay, so was that helpful, by the way? Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? We can wait to the panel. Oh, yes, go ahead. We'll take a quick one.
So how are you doing, sir?
Great, thank you.
How are you doing, sir? My name is Juan Camacho. I actually am a recent hire to EY myself. So
Welcome.
pleasure to be able to.
So be careful what you ask. That's good.
Hey, absolutely. But like you said, I'm going to keep it 100 as well. So my question to you is, I'm pretty new here in my journey as a college recruiter. I'm a campus recruiter myself. I go out there, right, connect with the folks directly, one-on-one and so forth and so on. I'm trying to still maybe identify a fine balance between, we want to keep D&I top of mind as we go through our campus recruiting efforts. At the same time, we want to make sure we have an equitable, unbiased playing field as it pertains to folks going through that recruitment process. In your opinion, how do we identify that fine balance as campus recruiters?
So as far as creating equity across the recruitment process, tell me more.
Correct, like creating equity in the process. We connect with folks and we bring folks through our, say for example, our pipeline, but at the same time make sure that we, at some way, shape, or form, have D&I top of mind as we go through that process.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I know you just started, and we should chat more. But you know, my goal personally, in working with Natasha as well, and make sure we embed D&I in all that we do in recruiting, including at the campus level, just across experience as well. I think this is why I'm trying to push universities, right? So the reality is, if we go to a campus, XYZ campus, and there's enough diversity, right? When we do events and receptions and work with organizations, there should be enough diversity that we see it and we can go. I told someone last week, or yesterday, I was at another event, I said, my goal would be in 5 or 10 years, we don't have to do special events. There's just so much diversity in and of itself that it could just be part of the normal process. The reality is it's not there at most schools today, so we have to differentially invest in order to create the pull-through. But it should be in everything that you do, and you'll hopefully continue to learn that, and that's how we should approach our events and the activities that we do on campus. We've got a number of D&I leads from the firm who are here who could help you, but we should talk more. But it's a great question. It continues to be a challenge for us. We do a lot of pipeline building, high school programs. There's so much that I didn't cover and have time. But as a firm, we do a lot at the high school level and, frankly, the middle school level to build diverse pipeline. And we'll all benefit. All the firms here, we hope, will benefit from that. Many organizations do the same thing. As Natasha mentioned, we're in this together. So the pipeline building that we collectively do, we'll all benefit. We'll get our slice of the pie. But it's a long-term investment and has been for many, many years. Great question. There's one more hand, and Stephen's going to give me the hook.
That's Lois. One more question, and we'll bring the panel up. Like a certain dictator in Italy in the 30s and 40s, I'm going to keep the trains running on time.
Okay. I still say benevolent dictator. First of all, I loved your talk. Thank you so much. Really helpful. I have a question for you. Looking back, hindsight, of course, 2020. It was when you're in terminally other land, right? When a culture is turning into diversity and you're the odd man on campus or whatever. Looking back, what was the internal shift you made to weather the storm, and what were the external structures within the culture that helped meet you there, and how can that be replicated in other cultures?
Yeah, great question. For me, it was a couple of things. I've always been a very competitive person. So I was kind of determined. I'm like, once I had someone talk to me, this is the other key. There was someone who, he was a partner at the time, showed interest and cared about me. And essentially he said to me, "You okay? Something seems wrong. Let's talk." And that gave me permission to say, this is not going great. And that allowed me to really share. And so that was the start of it. And then essentially he gave me permission. He said, "Ken, we hired you to be who you are." This is the way we before we talked about bringing your authentic self and all that stuff. He said, "We hired you to be who you are, number one. Number two, you deserve to be in this firm. So be who you are and know that you deserve to be here." Right? And those words, him giving me permission at that level, was a game changer. And then after that, I just had to get after it. And I did. But fortunately, I had him. His name's Alan Boston. But fortunately, I had him at the time. So you need people, mentors. You need folks to look out for you, like for your young people, your diverse people, whoever they are. You need folks to care about you. We talk about belonging. I'm sure many of you do too, right? We talk about this notion, this iteration of diversity, but it's about belonging. To the extent you can get people in your organization to feel like they belong, they contribute in a different way, they're very productive, and they add to the bottom line in a very different manner. But a lot of cultures are not prepared for that. And I will tell you, a lot of people leave organizations, including EY, because they don't feel like they belong at times. And you've got to figure that out. But anyway, great question. Man, I got so much more to say, but so does this panel. Please come up, my great panel. Give them a round of applause. We'll introduce themselves. But thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. Grab a seat wherever you'd like.
Yeah, so while the panel is getting seated, just as a side note, we don't need to go back, but a couple slides back where you had the slide up about different diversity, and it was like sort of what you're born with was the first circle. I noticed that one of those was personality, which gave me a great sense of comfort because I am the way I am, not because I choose to be that way. It's a disability. I mean, it's just that's kind of, so in that way I'm diverse. Dawn is right here, Dawn Carter. Recently joined Uber. Dawn was our host a couple of years ago when she was at Intuit. So we're super thrilled that she flew all the way across the country, got in way too late last night. Did you get a glass of wine? I did. You did, okay. So she's good then. Then we got Pam Baker. Pam is the CEO of Journeous, and she's also a member of our content expert panel. We have something like 12, 15 HR practitioners, people, experts in the industry, who we basically ping maybe once a month, once every couple of months with a question and like, we have a question from a job seeker and what kind of advice should you give, would you give them, that kind of thing. So she's very gracious with her time and participates that way. Kim Jones reached out to me a little over a year ago before our last event at Google and basically said, hey, great speakers, great panels, not a single woman of color. Thank you. Right? Right? We all need to be reminded. And I mean, I think from when I was putting it together, and I was the one who put together the agenda, I actually thought it was a very diverse panel, and it wasn't enough. And that's partly where today's event came from. Because of you being, Ken, what did you say? Aggressive?
Healthy agitator.
Healthy agitator. There you go.
Aggressive? Where'd you get aggressive from?
Yes, sorry, that's me. Yes, exactly. And then Joe Weech, who is a good friend of ours, taught us Faith and me, how to get front row seats at a Harry Connick Jr. concert. And where then I was like the guy with like 10,000 women. And that was an interesting experience. So I guess, again, I was diverse. And Joe's actually going to be doing double duty today. Our next presenter, Penelope Trunk, is unable to be here for personal reasons, but Joe is going to be jumping in, doing a presentation. If she stumbles at all in her words on this panel or during the presentation, forgive her. She was up at 3:30 this morning working on her presentation. So I will let you take it away. Thank you much.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate that.
And anybody has questions, remember, that's when it gets really interesting. And we have a microphone. We'll run around with the microphone.
Thank you. You can have a seat now. Thank you. So, appreciate you. Let's just start, do quick intros. Tell us more about this panel. Like, you're going to be in for a treat here. So the format is we'll do some intros. I'll ask them their perspective on bias, unconscious bias. I'll ask a couple follow-up questions. And then, frankly, we're going to turn it over to you. So you're right. You should run the panel. Like, there's a lot on your mind. You're here. We want to hear your questions, and we're just going to go with it. Does that work? All right, perfect. Joe, why don't you start here, and we'll work our way down. Mike's on the table there.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to, we have to turn it on. I'm pretty much a bellower.
Yep.
There we go. Good morning. Is this better? Okay, great. Well, I am really excited that there are this many people who care about these issues. You know, we all think, oh, I don't have any bias. You know, I'm just a clean slate. And then you pick Jif over Skippy. Hello. We've got biases. We just don't know about them. So sometimes it takes other people to hold a mirror up and you're thinking, whoa, that was in there. I had no idea, right? So I think that this is really great. We need to continually challenge ourselves first and foremost, look in the mirror, but we can't do that by ourselves. We need other people's perspectives in order to be able to understand where we're missing the mark. So I'm really excited to be able to participate here today.
Good morning. Kimberly Jones. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Kelton Legend. We are a talent acquisition consulting organization bi-coastal, Columbus, Ohio, and LA. It's warmer in LA right now than it is in Columbus. Interesting fact about me that has helped shape my perspective about diversity. I am the youngest of 11. I have 9 sisters and 1 brother. And so for me, growing up, being able to play in every color wig, makeup, choir robe, stilettos, a little bit of everything. So when I got involved in diversity and understood it, and I'm like, this is like growing up in my house. We all had to be a Jones, but we could still all be who we were. And so I've been able to carry that forward in what I started out originally as a talent acquisition professional, but being able to now as a consultant really help my client base across a number of industries understand what I call the power of collective imagination. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Good morning. I'm Pam Baker, the CEO of Journeous, and our focus is on making career launches better. And many of the young adults that we'll work with are from diverse backgrounds, whether socioeconomic or gender or racial or perspective. And what I'm particularly proud of is that through our work together that they recognize that what each of them brings to the world really matters with the tools to make the most of it. So glad to be here.
I know. Hi, everyone. I'm Dawn Carter, and I've been in the university and diversity and inclusion space for about 20 years. So prior to joining Uber, I spent my last year being the head of D&I for global talent acquisition at Intuit, and that was a really cool, unique journey. I look at this really in a way. I start just from my family. My dad's first generation, the first Carter to be born in this country, the first Carter to ever finish high school in 250 years of Carters. My mom is second generation, so we're definitely not from this country. We either came through Ellis Island or Angels Island, pick an island. But what that always taught us was, if I look back at my life, there was always inclusion from the very beginning. It didn't matter who you were or what you were always at our table. And I probably just how I was brought up, and it goes back to like who your bias is or who your things are. We all have bias. My bias, as long as like Alabama doesn't win the football game, I'm a happy camper. That's my bias, sorry. Or Seattle Seahawks wins, I'm a happy camper. But we all have it, and I'm excited for this conversation because we had this on our call, which is it's evolved eventually, and you always think you can fix it, and it will never be fixed. I don't want people to think they're going to walk out of their company door and say they've fixed bias. You will fix a portion of it, and then you'll go, crap. Now we have something else. And that's the fun part of our jobs in talent acquisition, is that we get to uncover, and now we have data scientists, now we have things that we just didn't have 5 years ago to solve the easier parts of bias, to then figure out what are the harder parts of bias to uncover.
Great. Thank you all. Joe, we're going to go back to you. Perspective, views on bias, unconscious bias. What does that mean to you when you hear those terms? You said Skippy and Jiff. But expand a little bit more. Let me give you the mic there.
So when you think about biases, you know, there are the ones that you know about, especially like your preferences for peanut butter. You just know that that's your bias, right? It's the things that you don't realize that you're biased against, and it's really interesting how we grow up in certain environments, in certain families, and that shapes how we view the world. Several years ago, I'm thinking maybe a decade at least, somebody had made a joke, and it became a kind of a joke that like elderly Asian women are bad drivers. And I laughed at that. Why? Because my mom was the epitome of that stereotype. She was Asian, an elderly Asian woman who was the worst driver I had ever known. So I thought that that was funny. So that's going back years, right? And then flash forward to now, where I've gotten to go through an evolution and understand how stereotypes, even if that's your only knowledge, in fact, all my friends' mothers were the same way. We all used to joke about it all the time, how horrible drivers they were. But understanding now how unbelievably racist that stereotype was. But that was my experience. So amazing how we can transform. And they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can see I've got gray hair. But obviously, we are still learning. If we care, we will keep learning. We will keep having other people influence us so that we can be better.
Thank you. Kim, same question. Views on bias, unconscious bias. What does that mean to you?
So a couple things. I mentioned this on the call. The term unconscious bias, I feel like it's being used as a buzzword and a Band-Aid. And so there are a lot of things that happen very overtly. And the company line is, we're going to be offering everyone unconscious bias training. If you obviously discriminated against someone, that is not an unconscious bias, that is conscious bias, and people need to be held accountable for it. And so the unconscious things, I love that you started with the slides talking about what our brain does. We tend to gravitate towards things that we are familiar with or we feel safe about. The same way that I wouldn't walk to a stove and see that it's on and put my hand on it. My brain knows not to do that. And so there are things that we have either decided that are bad or have had experiences with that are bad. And that comes into play when companies aren't just making decisions about who to hire, but when they are setting strategy. And so when you think about conscious versus unconscious, when companies say, we're going to attend the career fairs at the good schools, That is not unconscious bias. That is conscious bias because the CEO, the C-suite, someone who has the most money in their budget is funding your college efforts. And so I graduated from there and I'm great, so that school must be great. Maybe you're not great. Maybe you've been accommodated because you've been in company with your alumni. I like telling the truth. Sorry. Oh no, actually,
Oh, that's what
I
you
am
want,
not
the truth.
sorry for telling the truth.
Keep it 100.
Yes, so this concept of unconscious bias, I appreciate the psychology of making people more aware. What I don't want to happen, though, is people not also hold people accountable for conscious bias. You cannot send someone to a diversity training when sometimes what they need is diversity therapy. And so being able to introduce unconscious bias, not just in practice, but in strategy, but balance it out with also holding people accountable about conscious bias, those two are equally important.
Great point. Just quickly, and then we'll continue to work down. It'd be unfair for me to mention the school, but a few weeks ago, and this is your point exactly, there was a tenured business school faculty member who made some horrendous, racist, homophobic comments. It could be that school. And the university said, hey, we don't agree with it, but it's a First Amendment issue, and that's fine. I totally disagree with that position. I do think at some point, where are your values and what do you stand for as an organization? And sometimes you got to deal with the consequences. Yeah, you're going to get a lawsuit, you're going to go to court, but candidly, where do you draw the line? So I'm with you. And that was purely conscious, very conscious in the comments. You didn't even hide behind it. The university said, yeah, we don't agree, but we can't do anything. That's B in the other thing. Yeah. Yes.
The big B.
Big B.
A big fat B. So Natasha kicked off this morning saying we're really expanding the view of what we mean by diversity and inclusion. And some of the work that we do actually is with teachers and looking at the bias in terms of communication style, learning style, and what that means for all of the kids in their classroom. And so your ladder earlier, Ken, of that candidate asked a great question, a data-driven question. That means they're going to be a good candidate. I like facts and figures, and that means they're smart, they're qualified, they'll be successful. And some of what we find is that based on the different communication, what we refer to as channels that teachers prefer, that affects how students learn. So this starts early on in terms of what's perceived as good, the right way to communicate, to learn, to get motivated, and then it continues. And so when we can help teachers understand how can they communicate in a way that connects to all of the students in their classroom, and how can we work with leaders to communicate with everyone on their team that allows them to get the most out of the strengths of each person on their team, whether that's perspective or many of the other ways that we traditionally think about diversity, boy, you have a much more powerful team that way.
Yeah, great point. One follow-up. So my daughter, she's 15 now. My wife and I are very conscious. We sent her to an all-girls school. And we're very worried about the bias in the classroom, specifically around math and science, right? Because it's found that teachers call on the boys. And we didn't want that. So we took that variable. We sent her to an all-girls school. Guess what? She's thriving in STEM. Like, she's killing it. So the bias does exist in front of the classroom. That could be detrimental for some students.
It can, and equally, it can also be about, hey, I need a little bit of fun and playful contact in my day. I need a little bit of competition in my day. And how can teachers integrate that also in terms of how the teaching goes, and how can leaders integrate that in terms of how they're engaging their team?
Great, thank you.
I'll probably take it a little different slant. One is, as organizations, we're always asked to remove bias in the process. How many of us have been asked to remove bias in our recruiting process? Raise your hand. All right. If you're not raising your hand, you should be. So at my last company, we thought we took it really seriously, and we did some pretty radical things in our interview process of engineers. We actually removed our employees from the front part of the process because we thought there was bias. school bias, GPA bias, people look like me bias, pick a bias. And we found we had some. We increased women, underrepresented minorities, schools. We went from 20% schools that were not our core schools to 40% by removing them. At the end of the day, we still felt we had bias, but we didn't know what it was. And that's where we had a really great partner who was doing some work with the Chain Zuckerberg Foundation, and we figured out we had curriculum bias, and we didn't own it. So the schools own it. And what we discovered was that we're sitting here with these great steering committees of technical advisors to help create our technical, challenges online, but not all curriculum is created equal. So the class that you take at Howard your junior year, someone takes at Stanford their freshman year or their sophomore year. And so we were starting to experiment, and I didn't get to do it before we left, but we were starting to experiment with what if we could figure out how to identify school curriculum to map to our interview questions, so that we knew if somebody went to a smaller school or went to a community college first and transferred, again, they're not going to take classes till their second year, their junior year, compared to their first part of their junior year. How can we map what their knowledge should be to the questions? And so to me, that's around really digging deep into what that bias is and what the conscious bias is, which is we didn't own it, but we still knew it existed, to how do you start still removing that and get really creative with that. We didn't get to finish the work before I left. I know they're still kind of trying to think about it, but you sometimes can't stop where you think you've removed it. You have to take a step back and say, why aren't these students still making it through the process? And what does that look like?
That's great. Hopefully someone will continue to pick that up. I love that concept of really doing that research. Hopefully they will. Questions from the audience? We can keep going, but questions, anything in your mind, in the back there. Start in the front, then we'll go to the back. How's that?
Hi, Don. This is Rachel. I'm from a company called TriNet here locally. And actually, just what you said spurred a thought. So I think we often hear from managers, why wouldn't they want to go to the school that's teaching the curriculum sooner, that's going to give those students a leg up? How do you influence that? What is your perspective there?
Gen Z has totally changed the concept of that. And so there's a lot of great articles. Ping me afterwards. I can share some with you. This Generation Z is really choosing school very differently. They're still getting into Stanford and MIT and they're still getting into, Boston College. But they go to SUNY Stony Brook because they don't have to pay out-of-state tuition. So Gen Z, their parents lost 40% of their wealth in 2008, 2009. So for them, they will not graduate with debt the way millennials did. They also know they have access to the Googles and the Facebooks and the EYs, and they don't have to go to that school to find those roles. And so there's just a very huge mind shift, which I love, of how students are choosing schools. What we have to do is how do you find the students? And I can share some stuff afterwards.
That is great. Yeah, through technology, right, we can reach so many more students today than we ever had. The other thing we're doing now is we're starting to go to community colleges and really talking about the profession at large and figuring out how do we pull folks through. There's a question in the back, I think.
Yeah, hi, my name's Caroline. I'm from Synopsys, a large tech company. So for us, a big component of our diversity recruiting is females because of that kind of stigma, women in STEM. What are your thoughts on if there's mandates with managers to, you need to include females in your interviews? If you're interviewing 5 people for the job, make sure at least one of them is female. What are your thoughts on when there's kind of mandates? Because then isn't there a bias against the very well-qualified white male?
Thoughts, panel? I got some thoughts.
I know. I was just going to say, I want you to get down. Because we had this on we had a very lively call.
Let's go, Kim. What do you got, Kim?
This concept of pipeline, what's in your pipeline? And so I'm going to combine this with what you talked about. There has been, at least to a certain extent originally, a fact, but it became a myth that there's not enough diverse talent in the pipeline. And we are so far into these discussions that companies who really were seeking a particular demographic, whether or not it be a skill set or another demographic, I recall, you're left-handed? Yes. How many other people in the room are left-handed? Awesome. So if you know that your goal is to create a more diverse environment, and you are genuinely going out and you're not finding it, you have an obligation to create it. And so those of us who have been in TA for a long time, you always talk about this make buy. If I don't have it in my organization, I have to go out and make it. You can't make something out of something that's not there. So if your organization is looking for women and you're recruiting in places where there don't appear to be qualified women or female candidates, you have an obligation to help make those women. And so this goes to your concept about curriculum, where companies were looking for talent, like, oh, their curriculum doesn't teach this at all or teaches it late. Nothing stops you from then from teaching it, either teaching it in your organization and teaching it online, donating dollars to those organizations to help teaching it, being on their advisory board, creating the curriculum. And so I agree with you. You can create bias or exclusion of people who were qualified because now you're talking about quotas. I understand math very well, but you never have to create a disadvantage of one group to provide an advantage to another. And so if you're finding that you don't have those female candidates through your regular recruiting efforts, it doesn't mean disadvantage the male students who are qualified. It means do something different and a lot more deliberate in your curriculum, in that development of that curriculum, so that curriculum is then producing female students, so you don't have to stack the deck against anyone else for someone to have an opportunity to be considered.
Other thoughts, panelists?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I would also add, who's on the panel, how are you asking the questions, and where are you recruiting to find your pool? Because it's not just about we're not finding enough women and let's get more women into the panel. It's about what's that whole process look like? And then once they arrive here, how are folks then integrating into the culture? How are we truly making the most of them so that when folks show up for the panel, for the interview conversation, that they're seeing folks like them, and as they look online for what's the ratio from all the different kind of ethnicity and diversity groups, then are there folks like me who are thriving and rising through the organization?
There's an organization called Grace Hopper that many of you are familiar with. You should look into Grace. You should show up and have presence there. I'll take a slightly different view than my panel. I do think if you want to create the change, you're going to have to do something different. So whether it's going to different sources, that'd be the first thing I do. But I also think you have to differentially invest. So you can call it a goal, a quota, whatever it may be. The fact of the matter is, in your organization, you probably have revenue goals or utilization goals. You set targets there too. And so all I offer is, what's so different about this? Got one here, you as well. I love these idea fragments. That's a great question. It's perfect. Just give you food for thought. Guess what? If you disagree, that's perfect. That's what we want. If you agree, that's fine too.
Hi, my name is Courtney Jones. I lead university relations for Nielsen. To the point that you made about like the slate, one thing that I would caution you about that we kind of trapped ourselves in, we have diverse slate requirements. At least one female, at least one racial or ethnic diversity. What we found is, and there's research to support this, so I'll get your name and share it with you, don't just do one. Because statistically, you'll kill yourself. So we had a bunch of folks saying, well, we made the diverse slate requirement, we're still not getting diverse candidates. So we're like, well, we're not mandating diversity, but we want diverse slate compliance. Now we have two, and the way that it works out is you take bias out by having more than just one, if that makes sense.
It's an HBR article called Two in the Pool.
Yes.
That's what it is.
I was just going to say, yeah, two in the
Thank you.
pool.
So
Great
I
point.
just wanted to learn from our mistakes.
That's great. Got a question right here. Let me give you.
Hi, Janine Truitt, Chief Innovations Officer for Talent Think Innovations. Not so much a question, but just to kind of layer on some more advice. So I've worked for, not now, but for a really long time, I worked in federal contractor environments. And what I found to be helpful is you have to be willing to have really honest discussions with your hiring managers about what you expect without making it seem like it's a mandate. So when I worked for Brookhaven National Lab, for instance, we were beholden to an affirmative action plan. We were very much behind the 8 ball with things because of that one and done kind of mentality. One of the things that I used to share with my hiring managers was, hey, you know those initiatives that are so important to you, you know that science that you do that you get so excited about when you walk me around the laboratory? That's tied to a federal contract. And we don't get those federal contracts by having a bunch of people funnel in from the school that you have of choice. So here's the deal. Work with me. If the person that you have is the best person for the job, we hire them. But I'm going to need you to kind of mix it up. So, and it was from that lens because they didn't want to lose their money. It's like a help me, help you. You don't want to have to play that game in diversity at all, but sometimes that's kind of the conversation that you have to have for them to understand why it's important for them to incorporate other people in their slates.
I think to piggyback on that too is one of the things when we launched Data Scientist a few years ago, it was all around, I still remember having a conversation with our chief data science officer, and he's like, I want to go to all the HBCUs and blah, blah. I'm like, they don't have graduate schools. Oh, I didn't know that. And then I pulled the data, and I'm like, last year there was 22 African Americans who graduated with a PhD. 22 in this country. In this particular field you're looking for. Oh, okay. I'm thinking about this wrong. I'm like, yeah, so let's take a step back. If we look at more than just this particular degree of PhD, we can quadruple the number. And that's how we actually went from like 20% women to 55% women in our PhD class. Because we hired neuroscientists, we hired bioscientists, we really looked outside our little guardrail of field. And so I think sometimes that's another thing for you to think about with your groups is it may be that you can only hire this type of major, but sometimes even looking outside that major or that field can get you just a broader pool of students.
Yep. Got a question here.
Here we go.
Hi, I'm Mark Lloyd. I run University Recruiting for Tenable. I just had a question. It seems like when we're talking about pipelining and building the kind of a diverse talent pool, what challenges have you run across and maybe solved when it comes to looking at things past the biological, right? Past the things you can see, especially these days when, again, the term diversity is so broad and so encompassing of things you don't necessarily see when you're talking about neurodiversity, LGBTQ. What challenges have you seen there?
Well, Joe, do you want to answer? I know you're going to cover some of this later, right?
Well, specifically in our neck of the woods, we kind of both work in the just outside of the Washington, D.C. area. And I would say that with the specific types of people that we need to recruit for the roles that we have had in that specific geolocation, it is very difficult to find, first of all, people who really want to work in the Washington, D.C. area. So we have a hard time attracting people there, even if we offer relocation benefits, because it's a very expensive place to live. And then secondly, I would say that, and I'm sure you've probably found this as well as you all are recruiting, that there isn't a wide berth of people outside of white males for the specific types of roles that y'all hire for in your company. So it's very difficult to go outside that. And I find that technology, we all say, oh, we're going to be replaced by robots. We're never going to be replaced by robots, but we can certainly leverage, the tech tools to be able to help us. I will just mention one. And by the way, if I ever mention a company, I have no ties to that company. I don't even let them buy me coffee because I want, anytime I speak about a referral, to be purely that, my opinion. So seekout.io is a great tool that I used where someone sat me down and said, okay, you want to find, these sorts of people, like whether it's, and they were all tech roles, right? So they narrowed it to within 25 miles of Columbia, Maryland, and 135 people came up because they put in different distinguishers. We actually did it two ways. One was because we wanted to see if there were any African American or Latino women that were available and in our area, and there were 135 that came up. Then we did a blind recruitment, into that system, where all of the names had been redacted, and so we were just simply looking at skills. And then we were able to sort of have that playing field that was a little bit more level. So I think that we can leverage technology to be able to assist us to either target or do this blindly. Either way, it's still going to help us to identify people that we might not have been able to identify just by sitting behind, that social media platform that we're all on. So.
I mean, that's still very biological, and I was more towards the things that you can't see.
Oh, like the diversity of thought sort of thing.
Well, diversity of neurodiversity, LGBTQ, veteran status, things that people might not put on their resume you can't tell by looking.
Okay, so there's another organization, and I don't have the name, but I used it at the last DoD contractor that I worked in, and they will take your job description, and they actually are connected all over the entire nation with every single diverse group that exists. And so they have autism groups, they have, groups of people who were incarcerated, they have, people who are the African American, CPAs of the United States. There were all of these different groups so that you could have them send those out. They would actually identify, your company as wanting to reach those people, and then you would be able to draw in more people from groups that maybe you wouldn't have been able to reach just by.
I'm gonna so the Silicon Valley doesn't have a great reputation for women, African Americans, Latinx, and it just doesn't. It is hard for me to convince a mother from Atlanta to let her kid come work in San Francisco or in Silicon Valley, where I've worked before. It is not easy. And so you don't underestimate how much that can be a challenge. And that's why you see a lot of the Valley technology creating hubs outside of the big Seattle and San Francisco and Silicon Valley hubs, because talent wants to work for those organizations, and doesn't matter if it's EY or anyone else. We have to figure out how to go to the talent, and don't underestimate that in itself can be a bias too. If your company, I worked at Amazon for 6 years, and we wanted all of our developers to be in Seattle, and we kept saying for years and years and years, holy crap, that is not going to work it's only going to work for so long, and now they're having to look outside. So it is hard, and I think one thing internally in your companies is, if you're struggling with stuff, is pull in your employee resource groups. They're the bomb. They're going to help you. They're going to look at your processes, give you feedback on your processes, look at your schools, help you out on schools. But if you, they're a great wealth to give you honest feedback into who you are as an organization.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'll ask for just a couple final thoughts from each of you. The good news is we'll be around, so if you have specific questions you want to follow up on, I've got some thoughts for you. You should definitely come up and ask us. But just final thoughts, if we can work our way back, that you want to leave these guys with.
This is never going to be done. It's just the lens of what we talk about has changed in 20 years. And I also caution us that students don't want to be called neurodiverse. And they don't want special neurodiverse events. That's what we're hearing through focus groups. And so I think as an industry, we're going to have to really think hard about doing some of these events. We do women's events, we do this event. Students of Gen Z want niche events, but I think we have to rethink how we're talking about them to the students.
Thanks.
So my background was on the big company side. I was at J&J and Genentech for a number of years, and my experience was that the recruiting process can get stale. We can follow a similar process year after year, and then there are separate parts of the organization that are thinking about what are the skills and talents that we need moving forward? And sometimes those don't get linked up. And in a really tight job market, thinking differently about, so what are the ways that we find some of those skills and experiences differently? And it's not necessarily about Harvard, it could be SUNY Stony Brook. Thinking broadly about how do I pull folks in from different walks of life who bring some of these very skills that I'm looking for, and how do I create an organization that allows those to thrive and make the most of them, so that, again, folks see folks like them, whether that's biologically or with the experiences similar to them, thriving in the organization.
Thanks, Dawn. Kim?
I will say, as diversity advocates, as talent acquisition professionals, C-suite, we're all on this diversity journey. And what I would remind you is you also have students who are still on a diversity and life journey as well. And so a company that I worked for, we offered diversity. The company is called Meet on Common Ground. It's a video. It's kind of 6 vignettes. We offered it to students, and we had Vegas rules in the room because we wanted to have these open discussions. And about halfway through, one of the students raised his hand. He said, "Ms. Jones, I didn't meet a black person until I got to college." And I appreciated that he felt comfortable enough sharing that. But my question to him was, why was that such an epiphany for you? Because you knew black people existed. Did you have that same epiphany when you met someone Asian or someone in a wheelchair? And so my words to you is, as we're all going through this journey, keep in mind that you're meeting students who are also on a life and diversity journey. And so if you're recruiting students into an organization that values diversity and they have no value for it or no conscience about it, you have to meet them where they are. And if they're coming to your organization, you have to be prepared to do the work or make a decision that that person may not be right for your organization.
Thanks, Kim. Joe, final comments?
So how many here are responsible for the college recruitment at your orgs? Okay, so you know how we participate in the job fairs, and we have our booths, and that's what we do. It would be a great idea to contact the schools that you participate in, and again, take the advice of the panelists, go to different schools than just the ones that your C-suite went to, and find out all of the different groups that they have. They have so many diverse groups. Host refreshments for one of those groups, and then go in and say, so if, we would like for you to be invited to come and check out, our organization and our jobs, what would appeal to you? What language would draw you in on our job descriptions, and what would repel you? You will get a very, very honest response, and they can be your teachers and informers of how to shape where you go from here.
Thank you. My final comment is, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. So what are you going to do differently? Please join me in thanking the panel so much. You guys are terrific. Thank you.